How do you follow the Underground Railroad, a groundbreaking, genre-bending, Pulitzer Prize-winning novel? Colson Whitehead will be here to talk about his new book, The Nickel Boys. What can we learn about Earth's future from a visit to Greenland? Jon Gertner will be here to talk about his book, The Ice at the End of the World. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, our critics will talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Colson Whitehead is here in the studio to talk about his new novel, The Nickel Boys. Colson, we meet again.
Howdy do.
Howdy you do. You are here for your last little novel, a book called The Underground Railroad, which met with some success. A Pulitzer.
I was very glad, yeah.
The National Book Award, Oprah Book Club pick. Barry Jenkins is turning it into a miniseries. Is that still happening?
They're shooting next month.
Oh, wow.
August.
Are you going to be on the set? I'm
traveling, but if they're still going into October, I'd love to.
Then you have to sit down and write another book.
Yeah, I mean, I started writing this book in the spring of 2017, so I hadn't written for like a year and a half. And even though I was distracted by watching MSNBC 10 hours a day, being depressed about the news, I had to get back to work. And so I was traveling, promoting so much that I just started writing on trains and hotel rooms and planes, which was new for me. I usually like to hang around my house. But if I didn't do it, it wouldn't get done, so...
But you started writing a different novel before you began The Nickel Boys, a crime novel set in Harlem.
Yeah, I was planning it, and I was reading a lot of Richard Stark. I love his character, Parker. It was time to get back to work, and what became The Nickel Boys, it was called the Blackwood School for a while, seemed more compelling. And, there's a sort of argument about how to live between the two main characters, Turner and Elwood. And it seemed like I could maybe work out some of my own problems by putting them on the page.
Well, you've said that you kind of try to see yourself at least a little bit in every character that you write.
Yeah, I mean, generally there's some bit of me in my characters. I think Cora in the Underground Railroad has the least amount of me in her, which is probably why people like it more than my other ones. And in this case, we have Elwood, the optimist, the hopeful one who thinks the world can change, and Turner, the orphan, who's cynical and concentrated with survival. Both of those aspects of their character are in me.
Is the dominant one Turner?
I go back and forth. That's what the book is about. How do you make a coherent plan, coherent self when the world is terrible and that you have to keep on living?
In a recent interview that you gave to Mitch Jackson for Time magazine, you talked a little bit about your own family and about your father, and you said that his view of race was kind of apocalyptic.
I went to a French-English school. It's called Fleming in New York City, and they would teach you French. It didn't really stick with me. We watched Truffaut movies and made maps of France.
That's a fun way to learn French.
But, I asked him, why'd you send us to this school? And he's like, there's going to be a coming race war, and I think if you have to flee, you should have a second language, which is just totally crazy because... we could stay and fight. That's one option. And also, why French? We're going to go to Martinique or something? I don't know what his plan was. And so...
How old were you when you learned about the coming race war?
I was 10 or 11. That was sort of the background, the paranoid background of my house. But, with the real reality of, raising young black boys in a city where you turn on the news and someone's been put in a chokehold, someone's been shot to death, even though they are unarmed. A lot of his ideas about how the world works were true.
This was in the 1980s.
70s, 80s,
70s, 80s. And doesn't seem to have perhaps changed that much.
I came across the story of the Dozier School, which, my school is based on, in the summer of 2014. And it was a summer of Michael Brown being killed in Ferguson, Eric Garner being choked to death by a white policeman in Staten Island. And it's been my experience that, we have these high-profile police brutality events, and then nothing happens. The cops rarely ever are punished or disciplined in any real way. And then we talk about it, and then we stop talking about it, and then something big happens, and we start talking about it again. But nothing ever changes. And Dozier sort of fit into that scheme of the world. We have a school where students are being abused physically, sexually, sometimes murdered. The school's open for 110 years, and no one cares. Nobody did anything about it.
Let's talk about that history for a minute before we talk more specifically about the fictional version of it in the Nickel Boys. That school opened in 1900. Why was the school created, and how did it evolve over time?
In the late 19th century, they're trying to figure out what to do with juvenile offenders. If you put them in a prison with grown-ups, they'll, become worse criminals. There'll be, some bad examples. And so if we have a separate school, we can teach them 3 days a week, and they can learn the values of good work by working on the farm or other industrial work. And it opened on, the Dozier School opened on January 1st, 1900, so it was the start of a new century.
So this was allegedly part of or theoretically part of the progressive movement or prison reform movement.
Yes, it was a very enlightened notion. And then, of course, when people get involved, things go terribly wrong. You could go there for stealing a hubcap, for skipping school. If you were an orphan, nowhere else to go, they'd put you there until they could find a place for you, or you aged out of the system. If you were a ward of the state, your parents were drunkards or whatever, they'd put you there. And so it wasn't just criminals and the kind of criminal activity that could get you sent there. It wasn't, big at all. The first report of abuses came out in 1903.
Didn't take long. And periodically there'd be investigations and they would institute reforms, and then things slid back pretty quickly each time. And it didn't close until 2011. 2011?
Yeah.
And how did you become aware of this school?
Some freak on Twitter, and somebody tweeted a story about it, and it was like a little splinter that got inside me because of that terrible summer of 2014. And I knew sort of immediately I wanted to write about it, or it was a good story. Unfortunately, I was planning the Underground Railroad, so I put it aside. And then the Underground Railroad was so heavy that I thought the crime novel might be a good choice. Just my
a chaser.
Just my sanity. Eventually, I decided to write this book.
How bad did things get at the actual Dozier School?
There were solitary confinement. There were sweat boxes, iron boxes where, for discipline, they put kids in middle of summer to bake off their badness. There was a fire in the 1920s, and kids died because they were locked in solitary confinement, couldn't get out. Word got out about the beatings, and so they outlawed corporal punishment, which meant they just relocated it to a small utility building called the White House, a cement block structure. I talked to a survivor, and he said that they'd round up whoever was bad that week. You stand in line, 30 people waiting to get beaten, and you hear the person in front of you getting beaten, and so on. And you lie in a mattress, and they had a special black strap called Black Beauty, and they'd give you 10, 20, 40 licks. And the white kids called it the ice cream factory because you came out with bruises of every color.
Did you talk to a lot of survivors?
Not when I was writing. I had enough to have the place. I wanted to have my own characters. So I wanted to imagine my own boys in this place. And fortunately for me, there are a lot of memoirs, and survivors have a website. And the reporting by people like Ben Montgomery at the Tampa Bay Times is very exhaustive. Oh, and also there are photo archives, and so you can see the place and see the White House, and even in the pictures it looks terrible.
It's interesting sort of where you take that point of departure with historical fiction to cross over from the history into the creative. And with the Underground Railroad, the most obvious way in which you did that was through a kind of magic realism element. How did you approach making this story your own in this book?
The fantastic elements of Underground Railroad are there so that I can play with history more and step back and have a sort of wide-angle view of American society. And this one, I knew I wanted to be very intimate. I knew I wanted to be short. I was aiming for 200 pages. In the printed version, it's 215, so I'm a little sad. But I knew I wanted to be short, and I was reading a lot of novellas and short novels to think about how people approach the topic of what you leave in, what you take out.
Did that affect your style, too?
Starting with my book Apex Hides the Hurt, which is very linear for me and compact, and then Underground Railroad curbing my love for digression and, pomo pyrotechnics. I knew I wanted the sentences to be sort of simple, direct, and minimal from the start.
Some people look at historical fiction and they write it off as, oh, well, that's in the past. It feels apart from our current existence and conversation, but this book does not. The Underground Railroad did not. How do you see historical fiction, and how do you make it feel relevant and current?
Well, I guess I don't see it as a separate category. For me, it's just another novel.
Well.
So I'm not hung up on the labels or what it should do or shouldn't do. If you like it, it's a good novel, and that's how I think about it.
All right. This is actually a very good point for us to stop and talk about an essay that you wrote for the New York Times Book Review back in 2009, because we're talking about labels. A really funny, smart, sharp essay called "What to Write Next."
Yeah, so I was just thinking about different types of books. I was, thinking about what I was writing next, and I've definitely felt in my life there's the dilemma of everything's been done before. How can you make it new? It's been done before. It's corny, but these are the sturdy storytelling forms we've had since we started telling stories. And so, definitely with this piece, I was expressing anxiety and also reinforcing for me what not to do. Don't make it corny. So here it is. So the various things like domestic fiction, historical novel, Southern novel of black misery. Africans in America, cut your teeth on this literary staple. Slip on your sepia-tinted goggles and investigate the legacy of slavery that still reverberates to this day, the legacy of Reconstruction that still reverberates to this day, and crackers. Invent nutty transliterations of what you think slaves talk like. But hurry up, the hounds are getting closer. Sample titles. I'll love you till the gravy runs out and they're going to lick out the skillet. Sore bunions on a dusty road.
And you had another one in there.
A historical novel, yes.
Speaking of,
sweeping, meticulously researched, something about verandas. Welcome to the world of the historical novel. This is different from a book about a little-known historical fact in that you're taking a recognizable event or milieu, familiar from PBS documentaries and Oscar-winning movies, and putting your own spin on it. If you get sick of those tedious period details, gas lamp, chamber pot, chandler, oi, consider cutting between the past and the present, where the narrator discovers information about some ancestor's role in things. Throw in a real-life famous person, Jimmy Hoffa, Emma Goldman, the Lindbergh baby, and watch the sparks fly.
So you knew you didn't want to do any of that?
Yes. And I think I've always, tried to find the weird way into a subject. And so The Intuitionist, about elevator inspectors, is also about social uplifting the race, and the life of the city. And so I decided I was very self-conscious, and probably still am, about not doing what's been done before.
One thing that's interesting about the time period of this book is the Jim Crow era, which is, there are always books about the Jim Crow era, but there have been a lot lately, mostly nonfiction. You had Steve Luxenberg's Separate. You had David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass, recently Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s Stony the Road. Do you think there's a reason we're all looking at that period?
If you look at today's social unrest and division and racial discord, we haven't gone that far from the Jim Crow days. We can delude ourselves that we're making a lot of progress in terms of race, in terms of social equality. But then, of course, there are always things that remind you how far we've not come. And maybe it's a black teenager being shot by a policeman, or maybe it's swastikas being painted on the side of a synagogue. And so we extract great lessons from the work of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. Have we implemented them? Well,
what do you think that fiction can do with that subject that maybe nonfiction can't?
Well, I definitely respect historians and investigative journalists. I like making things up, and I like the freedom to move things around, definitely in the Underground Railroad. In this book, the freedom to have my own characters. It's grounded in the reality of what happened, but Elwood and Turner are my own creations, and I get to shape, deform their personalities to fit the story I want to tell, as opposed to what actually happened.
Well, give us a little Elwood and Turner, if you would, read some from the Nickel Boys.
Elwood, a straight-A student, inspired by what he reads about the protest movements in Life magazine, in papers like the Chicago Defender.
R.I.P. print edition?
Yes. He's a good kid. He hitchhikes with the wrong person and gets sent to the Nickel Academy, which is my version of Dozier School. Turner is an orphan. That's why he's been sent there, and also for other shenanigans. And opposed to Elwood, who's very optimistic, Turner has his own idea of how the world works, and some might say it's more realistic. Elwood met Turner his second day at Nickel, which was also the day he discovered the grim purpose of the noise he'd heard the night before, the industrial fans which cover the sound of the beatings in the White House. Most people last whole weeks before they go down, the boy named Turner told him later. You gotta quit that eager beaver stuff, El. The first thing Elwood noticed was the boy's eerie sense of self. The mess hall was loud with the rumble and roar of juvenile activity, but this boy bobbed in his own pocket of calm. Over time, Elwood saw that he was always simultaneously at home in whatever scene he found himself, and also seemed like he shouldn't have been there, inside and above at the same time, apart and apart. Like a tree trunk that falls across a creek, it doesn't belong, and then it's never not been there, generating its own ripples in a larger current.
Thank you. You are a very funny writer. I think that came out in the essay that you read earlier in the excerpts from that essay. And there's still a lot of humor in this book or there is still humor, I should say, in this book and the Underground Railroad. But it's not as overt as it is in some of your earlier work. Was that deliberate or just not feeling it right now? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tool like realism and a postmodern structure, a minimal structure, minimal sentences. And, I try to pick the right tool for the job. Before Underground Railroad, I wrote a book called The Noble Hustle, which for me is just like a humor book about being a weird, depressed, middle-aged man who goes to the World Series of Poker. And
True story.
True story. And I just tried to cram as many jokes, absurdist, non sequitur as I could. And so it seemed like writing a humor book and getting out of my system for the time allowed me to not tell as many jokes.
The Noble Hustle is one of 2 nonfiction books that you've written. You ever think about going back to nonfiction?
If something occurs to me, Colossus of New York, my first sort of book of essays about the city, happened but it was after 9/11, and I was trying to figure out how to live in my city, and writing about it seemed to make sense. With The Noble Hustle, I got an assignment from a pop culture website called Grantland, and it was such a great time. I grew up reading Tom Wolfe, Norman Mailer, and the sort of great wave of 70s nonfiction writers who used the tools of novel writing for journalism. And so, I always hoped that I'd find something to write about, and going to the World Series of Poker and writing about the game and how it works, and going out to Vegas for the big match was an important trip for me. We're in the Times building, the Port Authority's across the street, and I would drop off my kid at school in the morning, and other parents would be like, "Oh, how's it going?" I was like, "Good." "What are you up to?" I was like, "I'm going to Atlantic City to gamble." And then I come up here and go to Dean DeLuca to get a sandwich for the bus, and then gamble
downstairs in our building.
Yeah, and then gamble and train myself how to do tournament poker. And the whole 3 months was a really great time. And so I expanded the book because I didn't feel I was done with it.
I bet all the other parents at drop-off were pretty jealous. Let's end on the poker. Any poker lessons for writers? Was there anything you pulled out of that experience that you thought?
Well, there's overlap. You sit in one place for many hours at a time and learn the discipline of sitting down. We were with other people at this poker table but don't have to speak. And so I sort of described it as a Disneyland for shut-ins because you're actually, out and about but don't have to talk to anybody. And then, as you're reading other players, you're in the game but also without taking notes. People do this, normal people. But also writers are always, in the moment but also pulling back, and you have your weird gears going in the back of your head. The observational tools of poker also apply to writers.
And what about for the non-writers and the non-shut-ins? Any great poker lesson for life in general?
I guess they say if you can't recognize the bad player or the fish at the table, it's probably you. So watch out.
Okay, let's end there. Colson, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Colson Whitehead's new book is The Nickel Boys. It's reviewed this week on the cover of the book review by Frank Rich. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
What's new this week?
So we got a snapshot recently of what print book sales have been doing this year. NPD Bookscan put out its numbers for the first half of 2019 compared to the same period in 2018, and print sales fell by 1.9%, which is not, drastic or too terrible. The units dropped to 310.7 million, down from 316.7 million. And I think, everyone pointed out that last year was such a blockbuster year for nonfiction that really lifted sales across the board. And so when they broke it down into categories, fiction sales actually have fallen this year even more. That's continuing a trend that we've seen in the last few years. Adult fiction sales fell more than 5%. Adult nonfiction sales were basically flat. So it's interesting that, to see that shift continue. It's been very much a Trump phenomenon, sort of a Trump bump for the publishing industry. They had a lot of explosive kind of political tell-alls. And, of course, Michelle Obama's book was a mega hit beyond what anyone had anticipated. But there were also kind of surprise breakout nonfiction books. Tara Westover's memoir, Educated, has continued to sell really well. That's sort of like in the J.D. Vance hillbilly elegy tradition of a surprising memoir that tells you something about the cultural moment that we're in. Beyond that, there have been strong sales of self-help. So I think, that's a place where publishers are still seeing growth and looking for growth. And probably that decline in print sales just reflects kind of the lack of any breakouts in that category. I do wonder, how long people's attention spans will be sustained by sort of the political chaos. And I wonder if people are starting to kind of tune out of that. And if so, if we'll see fiction sales pick up again, if people are going to be looking for more escapist reads. The one kind of huge bright spot in fiction has been Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, which was apparently the top-selling print book in the first half of 2019 and sold more than 900,000 copies, which is astonishing. Yeah. That was sort of a bright spot for fiction sales. In the children's category, juvenile fiction fell 3.6%, which is somewhat significant. Publishers Weekly, in their analysis, said it was probably due to huge sales from two surprising titles last year, which was A Wrinkle in Time, which you wouldn't expect to sell so many copies since it's old, but there was the movie, of course. It sold more than 500,000 copies last year. And A Day in the Life of Marlon Bundo, the parody picture book that was, connected to John Oliver's show and got a big boost from his involvement. So,
Alexandra, what about you? Are you only reading nonfiction or are you reading fiction?
I'm reading fiction. I'm reading quite a bit of fiction.
Anything good?
Well, I recently reread The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood in anticipation of the sequel that she's writing, which is called The Testaments. It's coming out this fall.
Ooh, okay. Maybe fiction will come back in the fall.
I'm anticipating at least a few will. Yeah.
All right. Alexandra, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Jon Gertner joins us now. He is a journalist and a historian. He writes for the New York Times Magazine. His first book was called The Idea Factory, Bell Labs and the Great Age of American Innovation. And his new book is The Ice at the End of the World, an epic journey into Greenland's buried past and our perilous future. Jon, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Not a lot of us know a lot about Greenland. I think the thing people know is that, Iceland is the green one and Greenland is the icy one. But beyond that, I don't think people have a lot of information. Just tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. Greenland's the world's biggest island. That is, if you don't include Australia and you classify that as a continent. About 80% of it is covered in ice. This is a sort of remnant from the last ice age. There's only two ice sheets left on the Earth. One is in Greenland and one is in Antarctica. And the reason we care so much about Greenland's ice is that as it melts, and it is melting, it may pass a kind of point of no return and raise sea levels catastrophically.
I'll get to the point of no return later. Who lives there? It's like 60,000 people or 35,000 people?
Just about. It's about 57,000 people at this point. It has a large population of native Inuit who came over from Canada probably around the year 1200. And it also has a Danish population that dates back to about the 1700s when Denmark colonized the island.
Is it still part of Denmark? How does that work?
It's officially on a path to independence, but Denmark gives it a certain block grant of money to support its economy at this point. And in Greenland at the moment, there's a kind of hope that they can develop their economy through mineral exploration, maybe through oil exploration, through tourism, through fishing, so that they'll have a complete independence. But at this point, they do have their own parliament or self-governing structure in place with their own president as well.
And what are the natural resources in Greenland? I mean, is it like Alaska where there's secretly a huge amount of oil underneath or?
We're not sure. There are estimates that it has a fair amount of oil around the coast, especially on the east and west and the northern parts of the island. That's not necessarily a good thing because, of course, Greenland's melting because we're burning fossil fuels like oil, and we really don't want Greenland to start mining its oil. But there are rubies, gold. There's a vast store, it's believed, of something called rare earth minerals, which are used for electronics. And they're actually in the southern part of the island. One of the ironies of Greenland is as the ice recedes, it exposes more land that can be then exploited for minerals and mining.
Is that a real danger, that there's sort of people gathering around the edges saying, what's in there for me?
For sure. I don't know if I'd call it a danger, but it's definitely a moment where you can go to a town in Greenland and Nuuk, for instance, and there's all these sort of cowboy types who are kind of ready to take you on a helicopter to do some prospecting missions. I mean, so far the mining companies haven't really hit it rich, so to speak, but I think, there's a lot of people circling there and waiting for the right moment to exploit those resources.
So speaking of cowboy types, you mentioned that Denmark began kind of going over there in the 1700s, but there was an age in which the explorers came and, quote unquote, discovered it, right? This was in the late 19th century?
The colonization of Greenland goes back really to about the late 900s when some Eric the Red, who was cast out of Iceland for murder, came over to Greenland and brought a bunch of people, and they set up this colony, the Norse Greenlanders, and they disappeared. It's one of the great mysteries of civilization. Where did they go? And then Denmark recolonized it in the 1700s. But this ice sheet in the middle was impenetrable, and it really started to stoke the imaginations of a few explorers in the 1880s. And the first to cross it was a Norwegian named Fridtjof Nansen. And really that's kind of how my book begins. For me, I kind of wrestled with this question, when does the story begin? And for me, in many ways, the book was a kind of point where does human time crisscross with geological time? And the ice sheet has been this sort of eternal fixture in Iceland, and the first person who said, I'm going to cross this thing, was this guy Nansen.
What was that like in 1882 to cross Greenland?
Miserable. Everything in the Arctic always goes wrong, and it's always way worse than you think it's going to be. And, the first crossing for Nansen was these guys were pulling their sleds hundreds of pounds up the dome of the ice sheet, because the ice sheet isn't really a flat thing. It's sort of like a big hill of ice. And they skied down the other side, but they made it. And what followed his adventure were other explorers who were using dog teams, and then eventually, this age of mechanization began, and it became a lot easier, and the idea of a kind of heroic crossing of Greenland sort of faded away. One thing I thought that was interesting and surprising to me is, history's so messy, and I think today we have this idea that, okay, there was this age of exploration, and then there was an age of science, and they're very neatly partitioned, but of course it really wasn't that way at all. I mean, they overlapped in very significant ways. A lot of these early explorers were doing science. They didn't have the tools we have now. There was a lot of overlap with Nansen, for instance, was a PhD in zoology and in a kind of oceanographer as well. And even in later missions, these kind of heroic crossings were interlaced with scientific endeavors.
I think that's one of the interesting things about your book, is that the through line is discovery, going from that exploration to the kind of scientific discovery. Did you find it hard to sort of balance those just as a writer and figure out how that worked into one book?
Yeah, I think I did. I mean, I guess any book seems impossible. That was my case for the first one. The first book I wrote about was the laboratory, and it was a story of Bell Labs, this great laboratory in the 20th century. And the kind of sub-theme, I guess, was innovation. How do we use new knowledge to make new products or processes that change the world? And after I was done with that, I thought, well, I'd love to look at discovery and how we gain new knowledge. And I guess I felt that I didn't really need to sort of focus as hard as I thought I might to draw out that theme. It almost became self-evident as you sort of trace this chronology of discovery, of exploration and science, and you kind of see bit by bit how science builds upon itself and how knowledge is sort of revealed to us, and piece by piece, step by step. And I think certainly climate change we can think of now as a kind of story of doom, but in many ways it's a story of, heroic discoveries, one after the other, that were really hard won and hard fought, and how, as I guess Newton pointed out, we stand, every generation is going to stand on the shoulders of those that came before.
It's funny, I thought that you might be one of those writers who likes to sort of run away from the previous book, and that you were trapped inside a laboratory in your last book, and so you thought, okay, this one I'm going to get outside and and go to Greenland. Has Greenland become kind of, looking at these sort of cowboys and explorers and people now on, I don't know, what, snowmobiles or tractors? Has it become at all kind of Everest, where there's an overcrowding and people are thinking this is the last frontier, this is the coolest Lonely Planet destination?
I haven't noticed that where people are sort of lining up, and then unfortunately get battered by bad weather. What you do see is a ton of scientists sort of descending on this island. It's sort of a science nexus. I think in the book I call it kind of Los Alamos for scientists, especially glaciologists at the moment. And one thing about Greenland actually right now from the U.S., it's really hard to get there. You can be lucky like I was sometimes and hop on a military flight or a NASA flight directly. But usually you have to fly over it to Denmark or to Iceland and then fly backwards over to Greenland. And it's unfortunately it's not cheap either. So you have to really want to be there to get there. So thankfully it hasn't gotten that overrun yet.
How many times have you been there?
I went there 6.
Wow.
And I felt like I could have gone there 10 more. Just because there's no end. It's such a rich subject and a rich story, and it's still unfolding.
What were your first impressions when you landed in Greenland for the first time and started to explore?
The first thing you notice is there are no trees. It's this ice and rock and lakes, and it's a kind of stark, rugged, beautiful, beautiful place. And I'd go for these long, long, long walks of just nobody around. And I think, the lack of density, the lack of people is so striking. But, the one sort of thing I'll never forget is just the air. It was this kind of crystalline purity where I mentioned in the book, you almost feel like it's made from some substance altogether. So, you go from, say, Midtown Manhattan to Greenland, and it's almost like you've landed on another planet.
It's funny because people say that about Iceland, that it feels like another planet. And when I was flying back from Iceland a couple of years ago during the day, just flying over Greenland was so astonishing that it almost superseded everything that I'd seen in Iceland. I thought, I've never seen anything like this, just looking down on it from a plane. And one of the most striking things from that 30,000-foot view, to my mind, was that it looked like there were mountains, that Greenland was mountainous. I somehow imagined it flat.
Absolutely.
That it's mountainous, and then there were mountains floating off into the sea. These were like, I guess we would call them icebergs, but so huge that you could see them from way high up, and they were just floating outward, that it was not a solid mass, but that it was breaking up.
Yeah.
Now, this brings us to the rest of your book, I think. Climate change, is that normal? Have mountains of ice sort of always kind of fractured off and floated away from Greenland?
At least since humans have been observing the Greenland ice sheet, there's been a summertime melt and what you call a calving of icebergs from these glaciers.
This was not in the summer.
Right. Okay, so that run off the edge of the ice sheet. One thing I get at in my book is it's really hard to measure an ice sheet. I mean, we can talk about how big it is, but it really boggles the mind. I mean, just how much ice is up there and how it goes on for miles and miles. It's 700 miles across and it's 1,500 miles long north and south. That's just ice, and it's 2 miles thick. So, to measure that, to measure whether it's decreasing in size or increasing, was a real kind of scientific triumph. And what you had to do really was measure it from the air by satellite and airborne instruments that could kind of measure it through using lasers that kind of beam down to the surface. But yes, what we know is that the melting probably began significantly. In other words, the ice sheet began decreasing in size very significantly in the early 1990s. At the moment, on average, it loses about 280 billion tons of ice per year. And it's also accelerating. And we also know this summer in particular, it's been a massive melting of Greenland. We've read about in the papers and seen those images on television of these beautiful lapis lakes that run into the sea. So the ice sheet is in decline. The great worry is that we pass a point of no return. There are all these feedback loops to where the more Greenland melts, the more Greenland might melt. And what we don't want to do is continue, as we're going as a society, putting more carbon dioxide in the air, raising temperatures to the point where the Greenland ice sheet gets to a point where we can't stop the melting.
When people talk about ice melting and climate change, they usually talk about the polar ice cap. Is Greenland a bigger concern? I mean, should we be talking about Greenland more?
They're both concerning. I mean, the polar ice cap is what you would call Arctic sea ice, and that's floating on the Arctic Ocean. The North Pole is in the midst of that. And when that melts, it's not a good thing at all because it exposes dark ocean that in turn absorbs more sunlight, and that's a feedback loop too, and it gets warmer and warmer. And it's changing the entire ecosystem of the Arctic. Greenland's ice is on land. When it melts or breaks off, it falls into the sea, just like dropping 5 ice cubes in a glass of water, and it overflows. And eventually it will drown coastal cities and probably change the course of civilization.
Hard to follow from that. After the end of the world, now, why do people refer to Greenland sometimes as the air conditioner for the world?
The ice sheet almost creates its own weather, as the Arctic does. I mean, if you're a weather geek, and I wouldn't presume you are, but for those of us who watch these kinds of, images of the jet stream floating around, I mean, we see changes at the moment as the Arctic has been warming. I mean, the Arctic is warming at about twice the rate of the rest of the world, which was, in fact, another reason I wrote the book. If we want to look at the future, we kind of just have to look north because it's going twice as fast as the rest of us. But as this area of the world melts and as the ice recedes, as the temperatures warm up there, it seems to have profound effects both on atmospheric weather patterns as well as on ocean currents. And not all of that has been pronounced yet or detected yet, but it could have some very negative surprises in terms of bringing more warmer air up there, changing weather patterns all over the world.
You said look north. What about south to the South Pole?
Oh, yeah, there's problems there too, unfortunately. There's a glacier in West Antarctica I wrote about called Thwaites that seems precariously poised to fall into the ocean. And that too can raise sea levels dramatically. So I think we're at a real important moment right now. I mean, it could be 10, 20, 30 years. We don't really know, but we kind of are pushing the edge of these ice sheets, again, these remnants of the ice age that we've taken for granted as a kind of thing that would last forever, but we're finding now they can really change in human time. And in the course of a human life, they can fall into the ocean and drown cities and towns all over the world.
When we talk about islands being at risk due to global warming, I think often people think of these little tropical islands in the South Pacific that are going to just sort of disappear and be inundated, and that they don't really have the power to stop what the rest of the world is doing to them.
Yeah.
Who stands up for Greenland?
As Greenland melts, the native populations in Greenland are not necessarily discouraged by that idea. It provides certain economic opportunities. I talked about mining earlier, but iced-in harbors are no longer iced in. It changes the kind of ability to fish during the winters. There's also a kind of very complicated gravitational issue where Greenland's ice sheet actually attracts the water to it, and as Greenland has less ice, less mass on top of it, actually waters will move a bit away from Greenland and will rise higher in other parts of the world. So sea level rise is not a uniform thing around the world. Greenland might not suffer nearly as much from its own melting as some other places.
Like us.
Right, like us. Or, I mean, I think what's tragic, too, is that climate change, and I've seen great stories in the daily paper, and I've written about Tangier Island, an island in the Chesapeake for the Sunday magazine. It creates this sort of notion that there's really going to be winners and losers, and a lot of it's going to depend on money, on engineering, and just luck of being in the right place and having the right resources to create a kind of resilience against these rising tides.
All right. Well, that leaves me mildly terrified, which may be the appropriate reaction given the subject. Jon, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Jon Gertner is the author of The Ice at the End of the World, an epic journey into Greenland's buried past and our perilous future. Joining us now to talk about the latest in literary criticism, our critics, Dwight Garner, Jen Salai, Frost Sagel. Hey, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela. Let's start with you, Jen. What did you write about this week?
I reviewed a book called American Carnage by a Politico reporter named Tim Alberta. With all these political books, you're sort of reliving recent history. The subtitle, I can't remember the exact subtitle, but it has to do with he calls it the Republican Civil War and the rise of Trump. And so he's looking at how the Republican Party, which used to be known at least for promoting fiscal responsibility, social conservatism, has essentially become the party of Trump 2 years into his administration. So Alberta used to be a reporter at the National Review. And he has, I think, a really deep understanding of the conservative movement. And so the actual narrative starts in 2008, leading up to the presidential election then. And so he just covers the last 10 years to look at how, this civil war between two factions in the Republican Party, between the sort of more centrist moderates, the establishment in his mind, and the Tea Party version, how that essentially led to this moment that we're in, and that Trump really exploited the divisions between the two in order to become president of the United States. So I will say that the fact that Tim Alberta has experience as a reporter at the National Review, and he's been reporting on Republicans for more than a decade, and he really understands the movement. He also talks to a lot of people, and a lot of people are willing to go on the record with him. Mm-hmm. And obviously Republicans who have left office are the ones who tend to be the most candid in terms of their on-the-record quotes. But it's really interesting to see how, the sort of assumptions that they held 10 years ago, how certain things have changed. And he also looks at the political transformation of figures, establishment figures like Mitch McConnell. Mm-hmm. Paul Ryan is out of office, but his transformation as well, from somebody who condemned Trump in the primaries to, or maybe not condemned, that's perhaps too strong a word, but who didn't seem too happy about Trump, to somebody who really said very supportive things about him and then used the first couple years of the Trump presidency to push through a pretty extreme agenda.
So he's not just talking to other members of the disillusioned conservative press and punditry. He's talking to people that actually held office.
Yes, he's talking to people who held office. He also clearly has talked to Trump. So that's also another part of the book. Although I will say that one of the also good thing about this book, just considering how many so-called Trump books there are, is that even though Trump is obviously a very important part of the story, this is not what I would call a Trump book. This is more of sort of a recent political history and looking at it from the inside, I think. So I think it's, it really sort of stands out.
This book sounds good.
Yeah, no, it's really good. It's a long book, so I will warn people. It's, I think, more than 600 pages, but there's a lot of scene
and some juicy quotes
and some very juicy quotes.
Does he talk at all about?
Wait, give us a juicy quote.
She can't say any of them. I can't even absolutely unprintable. She was tweeting some of them though, and they were just
yeah, they're pretty. Michael Steele, I won't repeat exactly what he said, but he was the former chairman of the RNC before Reince Priebus took over. And, he is really
African-American.
First of all, he's African-American. He's also horrified by the fact that evangelicals, who you would think would be totally disgusted by some of the behavior that Trump himself was famous for before he became president, that they've now really supported him. Mm. And so he has a very spicy quote, which I actually can't say, but it's very good.
Use your
imagination.
This is one problem we have in the States that they don't have in Britain, where most of the papers there will print pretty crude language.
They really?
The TLS will print anything, and The Guardian will use some swear words, not probably all of them, but at least 5 of the George Carlin's famous 7 words you can't say.
Here we are on the podcast. We could say what we wanted, except our producer, Pedro Rosado, will beep us out.
Oh, that.
Parl, you also reviewed nonfiction, not a Trump book.
Yeah, no, I had a very dreamy week. I reviewed a book called The Vey Conjectures by Karen Olson. And it's a biography of, I would think, history's 2 most brilliant siblings, Andre Vey, the mathematician, and his sister Simone Vey, who is the philosopher, secular saint, mystic. And it's a book written by a woman, Karen Olson, who studied math very seriously in college and left it and started writing novels. But she becomes, in midlife, she just feels drawn back to mathematics again. And, the sort of euphoria of that kind of concentrated abstract thinking. So it's a book that braids together her memories and her love of mathematics with the story of these 2 extraordinary siblings and their childhoods and the work that they did. That kind of then opens up and sort of makes this beautiful case for mathematics being made more accessible to everybody. And the fact that it feels so abstruse and feels so esoteric does us all a disservice, because there is a real kind of ecstasy in that kind of thinking. And again, it's a small book, meaning that it's short, it's very elegant, it's sort of written in these fragments that kind of just drift over you. And I wrote in my review, like, there are no stakes in this book. Nothing is revealed. There is no suspense. But I read it I inhaled it so quickly. It's a very smart book to read in a hammock. It's a very lovely, delicious reading experience about some very complicated, thorny issues of philosophy and mathematics and ethics. But she's done it in this very measured way. Yeah, and it kind of, I don't know, I was reading it and I was thinking about, it kind of reminds me that there's such a pressure on books to sort of cut open the world and explain the world and justify their existence sometimes. And this book does what I wish more books did. It just uses that time that this writer has taken to study these people and to study her own experience and just burrow into it without making any grander claims for the subject other than the ones it already possesses. And it was just a lovely few days. So if you're looking for something, especially this summer, that feels smart but very readable and to open up new worlds that you feel are too rarefied or beyond you, it's a great introduction to so many kinds of issues in mathematics and philosophy.
I like her novels too. Olson is interesting mind. She lived down in Austin, Texas, and I think she's from the East. I could be wrong.
Yeah, she
went to school anyway up north, but yeah, her novels are quite good. I can't remember the titles now, but anything she writes is pretty good.
Yeah, very light hand, but always thinking about the big questions.
All right. Well, the segue there is big questions and slender book. Dwight, you wrote a book that I read earlier when it was in galleys, Turbulence by David Soloy. Soloy.
It looks
not
like
to
Zalay.
be confused with the correct pronunciation of the name, Zalay.
Although I don't pronounce my name correctly, so that's like
what is the correct pronunciation?
Who are you, actually?
The correct pronunciation for Hungarians is Szalai.
I've got to say...
We all pretended we heard a difference. I know. We all nodded very sagely.
Well,
emphasis on the first syllable.
Those at the book review know that Parl was hired as Parul, and it was a revelation to us.
I did not apply as Parul, but I was hired as Parul.
I spent half
that's
my
the way
time.
we accepted you.
I spent half my time in the world walking around correcting people's pronunciation of Parl's name.
Very good, very good.
Dwight, tell us about this book.
This book is very, very thin. I mean, first of all, David Soloy, which reads like Zalay if you see it in a bookstore. He's born in Canada. He grew up in England. He now lives in Budapest. He's written 4 previous novels. I've read 2 or 3 of them, and he's very talented, very sort of lapidary prose, very serious writer. He tends to take many stories and unpeel them like an onion, sort of the way that David Mitchell does a little bit, but he's a very different writer than David Mitchell. His new one is called Turbulence, and these began as BBC radio pieces, very short, and there are 12 of them in 140 pages, so they're very short. As I write in my review, you feel like you've gone up in the air with him and you're back down on the ground before you've had a chance to finish your little baggie of pretzels. It happens really quickly. They're lovely. They're a little bit slight. I mean, I enjoyed this book immensely, but it's not a big deal. Having said that, they're charming, and he has a lot to say about flying and about connections, international connections. People meet. Some of these characters are quite well-to-do and have a good deal of privilege and sort of travel the world for a variety of reasons, many of which to do with their own personal pleasure. Other people in this book, they're immigrants worried about being able to even arrive at an airport. And so these people's lives intersect, and it's very sophisticated. I don't want to put this book down at all. If you pick this book up, you will enjoy it. I just think
you can read it fast.
You can read it quickly. As a book critic, sometimes, as we all know, all of us, some weeks we have are just
the
brutal.
American carnage every week.
But not even that. Some weeks, if you're a book critic, you'll have a new 800-page novel, and that takes a long time to read. But if you're doing your due diligence, maybe the same writer has 4 other novels that are 800 pages before that, and you feel you have to go read those too. And in a week like this, where I'd already read all of David Soloy, and this book's 140 pages, I had a nice, simple week, and I, got my nails done. But anyway, this book, Soloy is a writer worth watching, and I recommend Turbulence.
Alexander Alter earlier was asking about this book and whether it was good and what was it. And the way I described it, which really should not, I hope, turn anyone off, but it is a smart that it reminded me of a smart literary version of Crash,
yes.
the terrible movie, in that it's doing that sort of intersecting characters thing where one character gets picked up from the previous story and then another random character gets picked up, and it's sort of that's the through line, and of course eventually not to overly reveal, but it does become whole at the end.
Everyone likes talking about airplane stories, too. There's something intriguing. As I carried this book around for a while, people are always like, oh, I want to read that. Because people are obsessed, at least some people, and I'm one of them, because I used to hate to fly for many years of my life. I'm sort of obsessed with airplane stories. And there's a heightened amount of feeling that comes with airports and airplanes we all know about, but that it can extend to, airport and airline fiction.
You wrote about this in your review that he titles his chapters by the
airport codes. Yeah.
Yes. And I was very stubborn about it, and then I didn't want to pause and look up what the airport code was, but a lot of them were unfamiliar to me, and I sort of kept reading, figuring it'll reveal itself in the book. What did you do?
It doesn't. I looked them up instantly because I just wanted to know where I was. One of the worst feelings for a book critic is to feel entirely lost, which is one way that book critics read differently than other readers. I forget who it was, Nadine Gordimer or someone said she doesn't mind being lost for a while in a novel, but I hate it as a critic because I feel if I get too far lost, I may not be able to connect the right dots for the reader. So I look things up quickly and try to figure out where I am. Sometimes you have to give into that lost feeling, though, I think.
Would you, Pearl, Jen, would you guys have looked up the airport codes if you didn't recognize them? I mean, just to give you an example, of course, I've turned to something super easy, but let's see.
Do the characters leave the airports, right? I mean,
they
it's
do.
not. Okay.
They do. But the title, if a chapter was titled YYZ.
Oh, I
She's
know.
on that.
I know
Yeah.
YYZ.
Yeah.
She's Canadian.
Oh,
Toronto.
God. Moving on. If a chapter was titled
The podcast is just going to devolve into this.
Salai,
Dash.
YYZ.
GRU, would you have looked it up or would you have just gone with it?
I think I read a little bit differently than Dwight in that I think I would assume that I was not supposed to look them
Right.
up, and I would try to look for cues. And then I would also think that as part of the comment, because there's this huge body of like airport fiction, and sometimes a lot of the commentary associated with that is that it's a separate space, that all of these places are very similar, that this other zone of like globalized culture has been created. So I don't know. I think I would embrace the lostness, but if it's not obvious, absolutely I would go back.
If it got to be a problem, though, if it did feel like he was trying to sort of be oblique in a way that wasn't, for whatever reason, working, then...
I'm also just so much lazier than Dwight. Really.
Well, one of the good experiences I had while reading this book, I was away visiting some friends. Well, first, one thing I did was take these airport codes, and I, at a dinner party, questioned everyone about how many they knew, which is really interesting because some people are really well-traveled. Other people you think would know some of these don't know any of them. But I went to the library and got out a copy of Arthur Haley's 1968 classic Airport, featuring Mel Bakersfield in his attempts to keep Chicago O'Hare open during a snowstorm. And Mel is so macho. It was this throwback, but it wasn't terrible. Arthur Haley could actually write. He has this cheesy pull, and I almost wanted to finish it. I'm not going to.
Yeah, I want to read an essay about that, Dwight.
About Mel Bakersfield and me? Okay.
All right, Dwight, your next assignment. Let's go over the books you all reviewed this week again. Jen?
Tim Alberta's American Carnage.
I reviewed The Vague Conjectures by Karen Olson.
I reviewed Turbulence by David Saloy.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks,
Excellent.
Pamela.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.